U.S. would not seek to impose its values on other nations, but he did single out a handful of countries he considers enemies, going so far as to call them evil and putting them on notice. The president leveling a harsh threat to North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, whom he called Rocket Man. He didn't just call Kim that in a tweet. This was in his UN speech, the same one in which he warned that the U.S. would, quote, totally destroy North Korea, a nation of 25 million people, if forced to defend itself or its allies. Here's CNN Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto coming to us from the UN with the Trump doctrine.
Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell.
In his maiden speech before the UN, President Donald Trump delivered a blistering attack on nations he described as evil and grave dangers to the world.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength.
The president giving the more than 150 international delegations present an upfront look at his America First foreign policy.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first.
He reserved his boldest threat for North Korea, vowing in unequivocal terms to destroy the country if it threatens America's or its allies' security.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
For Iran, Trump described its government as murderous and reckless and appeared to signal that he will exit the Iranian nuclear deal.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it. Believe me.
Praising Mr. Trump's remarks was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said he had, quote, never heard a bolder or more courageous speech in 3 decades of experience with the UN. The president's address also taking aim on what he described as growing terrorist threats around the globe.
The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists.
Beyond the threats, Trump's speech more clearly articulated the outlines of his foreign policy, including a drastic turn from a tenet of U.S. foreign policy for decades, that the U.S. will support democracy abroad.
This is the foundation for cooperation and success. With different values, different cultures, and different dreams, not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect.
Of the many bold words in the speech, Jake, the threat to North Korea sparking really the strongest response. I spoke to a senior UN diplomat in the room who said that when Trump uttered those words, threatening to obliterate, this diplomat said, another nation, that the diplomats in the room were taken aback. It was, in his words, it felt like a wind had swept through the room, an emotional response from those present, unlike anything they'd heard from an American president before. Not to be lost in that, his comments about the Iran nuclear deal, there were those in the room who thought the president was going to withdraw from the agreement on the spot. He did not. The next deadline for him to recertify the agreement is October 15th. We'll see what happens then. Jake?
All right, Jim Sciutto at the UN for us. Thank you so much. Joining me now outside the UN as well is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Republican Congressman Ed Royce of California. He visited South Korea earlier this month. Mr. Chairman, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
I don't want to get this wet, so.
Good to be with you, Jake.
So the president said that the U.S. is ready to totally destroy North Korea if necessary. He also called Kim Jong-un, quote, Rocket Man, said that the Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. Did using that kind of language in a UN speech surprise you? And is it the right approach to giving North Korea an off-ramp, getting them to the negotiating table?
Jake, these aren't the words I would have used, but what I will share with you here is that, in point of fact, our biggest challenge right now is applying full diplomatic and financial pressure on North Korea and getting compliance from these other countries to do it. This is a hydrogen bomb that they have at their disposal. And so this is a response by our president to focus full pressure, full diplomatic and financial pressure. We need compliance with these sanctions.
North Korea, of course, has shown no willingness to give up its nuclear program or to stop test firing missiles. Do you think that a military confrontation might be inevitable?
No, here's what I think. We know from 2005, Jake, that when we put sanctions, financial sanctions on the banks in China that were necessary for the support of the system in North Korea, that the dictator at that time could not pay his generals, and they did not have the money for their ICBM program, and they had to discontinue momentarily for a period of many months that program. We need to do that again. That's what these sanctions are intended to do. We need the China Merchant Bank, and we need the Agricultural Bank of China, the state-owned bank, to comply. They do much more business with the United States than they do with North Korea. They need to comply with these sanctions, and we should give them a choice between doing business with us or North Korea. We're headed in that direction by sending this message, because if we do that, we ultimately have the leverage on North Korea to once again get them to the table or get them into compliance. Until we do that, we do not.
Do you think that President Trump is trying to, for want of a better term, scare the Chinese into thinking that he might actually launch a strike, a preemptive strike against North Korea, so that China is finally motivated to take these actions by their banks that you've been pushing for so long?
Yeah, you know, China's a little conflicted on this, Jake, because they've shared with me, they don't want South Korea, they don't want Japan to develop a nuclear weapons technology. They'd like to head that off. And right now, there's only one way for them to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And that is to face up to the fact that 90% of the subsidy still comes from Beijing. So we have to figure out how we message to Beijing the necessity of compliance now with the international community, with what Nikki Haley has done in terms of international sanctions. And that means cutting off the support that goes directly, all of it goes directly into supporting the military or supporting the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile and Atomic Weapons Program. That's where we have to be focused.
Secretary of Defense Mattis said yesterday that there are military options the U.S. could take with North Korea that would not put Seoul, South Korea, at grave risk. Without revealing classified information, what would an option like that look like?
Unfortunately, I can't reveal that to you without revealing classified information. But I will return to the desire not to get to that point, the desire to figure out a way to shut down their program by taking away the foreign currency that they need to run it. They need billions upon billions of dollars every quarter to run this program. We can cut it off with the international community. That's what we're trying to do. That is better than the other options. I don't think we need to go down the road of just what those options are right now. But I appreciate the thrust of everybody's focus here on getting a solution now that they have a bomb 17 times more powerful than what was dropped at Hiroshima.
President Trump, of course, criticized the Iranian nuclear deal, called it an embarrassment to the U.S. Sources tell CNN the president's still evaluating what course of action to take. He seemed to suggest he's ready to withdraw. Iran has technically complied thus far, and its president, Hassan Rouhani, warned that the U.S. ending the agreement would, quote, carry a high cost for the U.S. Would you recommend that President Trump tear up the deal?
Well, here's the situation we're in. Iran is violating the spirit of the agreement, right? And they're also doing this with their intercontinental ballistic missile program. Intercontinental means from there to here. But the difficulty is $100 billion worth of leverage in terms of the money that was withheld from Iran in international sanctions has now gone into the hands of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They now have this money, and so in a way, the toothpaste is out of the tube. So going forward, how do we focus on compliance and enforcement of the agreement, and how do we focus on preventing them from moving forward with their intercontinental ballistic missile programs, as well as their movement of troops to the border with Israel, into Syria, across from the Golan Heights. These are the big challenges. On August 2nd, new legislation that I authored went into effect that allows us to put specific sanctions on Iran for these issues, and I think that's where I'm focused right now in terms of compliance and Iran drawing back from the border with Israel.
But just to be clear, you're saying that you do not think he should withdraw?
I think we should enforce the hell out of the agreement and thereby force compliance on the part of Iran.
All right, Congressman Ed Royce, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Appreciate it as always. Oh, now we go to Capitol Hill, where a Senate panel abruptly called off Q&A today with President Trump's business attorney. But that doesn't mean the longtime Trump associate has completely dodged tough questions from the senators. Why he will now have to face lawmakers in front of the cameras, that story next.
The Lead with Jake Tapper, brought to you by Taltz.
Look at it. No, don't look at it. Stay. Okay. Shh. I'm freaking out.
Sapphire Reserve from Chase. Make more of what's yours.
We're back with our politics lead in the intensifying Russia investigation. President Trump's business lawyer, Michael Cohen, was scheduled to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee today behind closed doors. But that interview was abruptly canceled. Now, the leaders of that committee say they want Cohen to appear before the panel publicly. CNN's Manu Raju joins me now live from Capitol Hill. Manu, what happened?
Well, it was a pretty abrupt cancellation. Michael Cohen was actually sitting down talking to the Senate committee staff when the staff learned that he had put out a public statement defending his efforts and saying that he did nothing wrong in the whole Russia collusion issue, saying that he was completely innocent and attacking some of the charges that have come out in the press. Now, what the committee said was that this essentially went against their request to say that he should not make any public comments whatsoever about his own about this interview, saying that this happens behind closed doors, and in a very sharply worded statement saying that they would have an open session in a date in the near future. This also came is rather a surprise because Cohen is seen as one of the more high-profile people to come before this committee. A lot of questions about his role in advocating for a Trump Tower project in Moscow. Something he said in the statement was just a real estate deal and nothing else. But clearly, Jake, the concerns about him undercutting what the committee believed was an agreement was enough to abruptly cancel this hearing, and the committee wanted to show that they're taking this seriously by making this threat for a public hearing in the coming weeks, Jake.
Meanwhile, Manu, CNN broke the story that former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort was wiretapped both before and after the election. Also, that there were communications picked up that sparked concern that Manafort had been encouraging Russian operatives. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, very significant, broke by our justice team, saying that the U.S. investigators did obtain the secret orders to wiretap Paul Manafort before and after the campaign. And interestingly, also, some of this snooping actually occurred at a time when Paul Manafort was been known to actually be speaking with President Trump. Now, we don't know if any of President Trump's own communications were picked up, but that has raised questions about whether or not they have, but also raising questions about how serious and legal jeopardy that Mr. Manafort may be in. Now, to that point, Jake, the New York Times reporting that after Mr. Manafort's home was raided in July, that investigators with Bob Mueller's team issued a warning saying that, yes, indeed, that he will almost certainly be indicted in the coming weeks. And that's raising a whole series of questions here on Capitol Hill, Jake. A number of committees do want to talk to Paul Manafort, including the Senate Judiciary Committee. But now, in light of all this news, new questions being raised about whether or not they can even bring Paul Manafort in for further questioning. This is what Senate Judiciary Chairman Chuck Grassley told me earlier today.
Wouldn't you think, since he's been told that he's going to be indicted, that he wouldn't come before the committee, and that if he did come before the committee, we wouldn't get any information out of him? We have made for weeks trying to get phone calls returned from his lawyers, and they haven't returned the phone calls.
So some frustration there from the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman about not getting his phone calls returned from Paul Manafort's representatives. They're not ruling out the idea of still issuing subpoenas. Dianne Feinstein, the top Democrat on the committee, saying that's still a possibility in light of all this news, but clearly a new wrinkle in this investigation, both on the Hill and going forward with these new revelations in which the wiretap issue in particular, Jake, caught leaders here by surprise. Even Richard Burr, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, did not know that Paul Manafort was being wiretapped, Jake.
Well, Manu Raju, thank you so much. Coming up next, the latest on that major 7.1 earthquake to rock Mexico. And also coming up, preparing for impact, Hurricane Maria on a collision course with U.S. territories. The dire warnings coming out now with the Category 5 hurricane just hours from its next landfall. Stay with us. Welcome back to the lead. Our politics lead now. President Trump today addressing the United Nations General Assembly, calling for North Korean isolation and warning Iran to stop spreading terrorism across the globe. Notably absent from the president's speech were the words climate change. Mr. Trump has promised to pull out of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, despite much criticism from other world leaders as well as public officials here in the U.S. Joining me now is one of those critics, California's Democratic Governor Jerry Brown. Governor Brown, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here.
So yesterday you suggested President Trump's approach to North Korea was, quote, stupid and dangerous and silly. I know you don't care for the term rocket man about Kim Jong-un, but to play devil's advocate,
sure,
is it not possible that this tactic might work because everything else has failed with North Korea, from Clinton to Bush to Obama, who tried it the diplomatic way?
Yeah, if you believe in bluster and starting a bluster war with North Korea, which is what they do. And they're pretty darn good at invective and threats one after the other. So I think bluster is not the pathway of diplomacy or even statesmanship. Sure, these are real serious issues, no doubt about it. We've got to work closely with China and Russia and South Korea and Japan. But just noise and threats, we're going to kill every man, woman, and child in North Korea, that doesn't advance the ball. It just raises the temperature and the exchange of non-rational bluster back and forth. I don't think that's positive.
Speaking of raising the temperature, you're at the UN General Assembly with other Democratic governors to participate in Climate Week. President Trump, we're told, aired his dissatisfaction with the Paris Climate Agreement during a meeting with the French president, saying that other countries, namely China, received a better deal than the United States. Is it not true that China set lower standards for itself than did the U.S.?
Look, China is doing more than the U.S. right now. They're closing down coal plants. They're massively investing in solar and wind. They're mastering battery technology, which will help America. So this point that America got a bad deal is fake. It's more fake than any fake news assertion by President Trump. This agreement is so fundamental. I mean, you watch all these hurricanes and the devastation, you can't take your mind off extreme weather events. That's exactly what climate change is going to bring about. It may already bringing them about. So to omit that, an existential threat, climate change, that's what it is. It's irresponsible. It's blind. It's almost, I don't even know how he gets away with that. I have to call that fake news, or whatever you call a president's speech of that order.
In reference to climate change, this week you compared Trump supporters to cave dwellers. You said, quote, you should check out the derivation of Trumpite and troglodyte because they both refer to people who dwell in deep, dark caves. Are you really calling the nearly 63 million Trump voters cave dwellers?
No, and if you saw your own words there, it was about Trumpite and troglodyte. It wasn't about the millions of voters who voted for President Trump, many of which are right in California. No, the people who closely advise climate denial, advise bluster wars, advise stigmatizing and delegitimizing our entire news industry as fake. Yeah, that is really, I won't call them cave dwellers because cave dwellers didn't have TV like that. But it is a blindness. It's a darkness that evades the truth. It really generates the kind of disinformation that undermines democracy and doesn't build dialogue, which we desperately need in this country and between nations around the world.
I want to ask you about some legislation that you have on your desk. Over the weekend, California passed a bill making the Golden State a sanctuary state.
Well, no, wait a minute. There's no word sanctuary. This is a bill to have the Immigration Service do their own work and not attempt to conscript state officials into being part of the Immigration Service. It does allow close cooperation on data, on drug busts and drug raids, and also working with the Immigration Service, whether it's from our prisons or from the jails when you're dealing with serious criminals. So it protects public safety, but it also protects hardworking people who contributed a lot to California.
Hardworking people who are undocumented immigrants.
Yeah. By the way, they've got a couple million working. Our agricultural industry, our hospitality industry, our construction industry, they'd be in deep trouble without those same people. And that's why we need immigration reform, not bluster, not rhetoric, and not this kind of xenophobia that we see too much of coming out of Washington.
Do you think that complying with federal immigration laws it's optional? Because that would be the counter argument.
No, and we comply with immigration laws. We're not soldiers of Donald Trump or the Federal Immigration Service. We have our own laws to arrest criminals, to give them a jury trial, and then to provide appropriate punishment. That's our job. Now, the immigration people can come over to our jails. They can interview people. They can pick up people that they think are appropriate. But don't tell California to do your work. In fact, there are many cases of people who the Immigration Service said they wanted, and they don't even show up to come to get them. So this is a well-balanced bill. The police chief of Los Angeles supported it. There's a number of law enforcement officials who said it was a much better piece of legislation than what was originally introduced and which got the name Sanctuary City or Sanctuary State.
Another piece of legislation passed in the California State Legislature Friday would require presidential candidates to release their 5 most recent years of tax returns in order to be able to get on the California ballot. President Trump has, of course, infamously refused to release his returns. He says he's under audit. You also have not released your tax returns. Do you plan to sign?
Well, actually, I did release them in my earlier campaigns. This time around, my opponents wouldn't do it, so I didn't either. I'm not going to tell you what I'll do in the bill. I want to read it. I want to look at the legality in the face of federal law. So we'll take a look at it. I generally don't opine on the 600 bills that the legislature leaves on my desk. I take a look at each one. I'll give this a fair read, and you'll hear my decision very soon.
All right, California Governor Jerry Brown, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up next, the New Life Republicans are pumping into yet another effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. Why the clock is ticking fast on what could really be a final Hail Mary attempt. Stay with us.
Call 1-800-4SEASONS today. 4 Seasons. It's time.
This is CNN, the most trusted name in news.
Back with more breaking news in our world lead. A 7.1 magnitude earthquake that just hit Mexico, the epicenter about 75 miles outside Mexico City. President Trump just tweeted about the earthquake saying, quote, "God bless the people of Mexico City. We are with you and will be there for you." Let's bring back CNN's Allison Chinchar. Allison, what more are you learning about this earthquake?
Right, again, so it was a 7.1 magnitude quake, again, just to the southeast of Mexico City. The depth was 32 miles. While this may seem relatively, it may seem pretty deep to you, in terms of earthquakes, it's not. 32 miles is about 51 kilometers. Anything below 70 kilometers is considered a shallow quake, and this is well below that. So again, when we talk about how deep or how shallow it is, that often has a direct correlation to the amount of damage that you can end up seeing from a quake. Now, we also talk about size, okay? Here's a look. About 28 million people felt some type of weak shaking with this quake. 20 million felt moderate shaking, and about 1.5 million felt very strong shaking. Jake?
I want to turn to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands for a second, because they are also engaged in a frantic activity. They're preparing for a worst-case scenario as a Category 5 hurricane is moving closer to them. What's the latest track?
The latest track still puts it directly over portions of Puerto Rico. The storm has intensified. It's now up to 165 miles per hour. If it stays at this current strength, it will end up being the strongest hurricane to hit Puerto Rico. It's already close enough now that we can actually pick up some of these outer bands on Puerto
Rico. Could Maria bring?
In widespread, you're talking 6 to 10 inches, but there will be several spots that pick up 15, even 20 inches. And Jake, that not only causes problems for flooding, but also can trigger mudslides. We've seen it happen in the past with other storms, so it's very likely with this storm as well.
All right, Allison Chinchar, thank you so much. Let's go now to CNN's Nick Peyton Walsh in Palmas del Mar along the eastern coast of the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. Nick, where you are right now, that, I believe, is the area that could get the most directly hit from what you're seeing. Does Puerto Rico appear ready for the storm?
They've had adequate warning, Jake, and this is a beach resort that has been cleared out, boarded up, and is certainly ready here because, frankly, it's this coastline right behind me that could be the first part of Puerto Rico impacted by Maria, possibly between 2, 4, 6 o'clock the coming morning. We're not exactly sure when. We do know, though, that it's gathering speed with great intensity. You heard 165 miles an hour there. Well, it was only 65 miles ago, 30 hours earlier, so it's moving incredibly faster as time goes by. Now, the broader question, of course, is that Hurricane Irma gave a sort of glancing blow to Puerto Rico just about 2 weeks ago or so now, still caused $1 billion worth of damage. There are still 46,000 people without power after that. The issue really is, has the damage sort of been done? Are people adequately prepared or ready for this because they've been in a state of emergency for quite such a period of time, or are we going to risk even further damage? The winds could be utterly catastrophic. They're telling people to get away from flood risk areas. Where I'm standing here, the water could possibly rise in a storm surge to almost twice my height. So definitely perilous hours ahead, Jake.
Puerto Rico's governor urging citizens in the flood zones to evacuate. Are people heeding the warnings from the government?
From what we've seen, yes. I mean, there are 500 shelters in place. But bear in mind, too, that Puerto Rico has become a shelter for those fleeing the damage from Hurricane Irma on other outlying Caribbean islands. In fact, I saw some people at a hotel we were staying at last night seeing if they could get a room because they'd fled another adjacent island. So, yes, there's definitely concern here for the level of shelter that can be provided for people. Concern voiced by government officials about how many people have already gone to shelters. We know, everybody knows this is coming. There's no doubt about that. The question is, how seriously are they taking it? You mentioned the possibility in that earlier report of 25 inches of rain. Well, that's kind of up to here on my leg or so. So we're going to see an incredibly large amount of water dumped on this island. There are many buildings, many trees that potentially weakened by Irma. And the question really is exactly how many people have put themselves out of harm's reach, and quite what does a hurricane of this force? You have to be over 89 years old to have seen something quite as powerful as this before in your lifetime. So serious questions is exactly what the days ahead can bring, and we will be standing right in its forthcoming path, Jake.
All right, Nick Peyton Walsh, be safe. Thank you so much. He's called Trump supporters cave dwellers. He's described Trump's North Korea strategy as stupid and dangerous. Now, California Democratic Governor Jerry Brown is here to react to President Trump's unconventional address at the UN today. I'll talk to the governor next.
I'm worried I can't find a safe used car.
You could start your search at the all-new Carfax.com.
That might help.
Response from Democrats, thanks but no thanks to the Graham Cassidy bill, saying the words I kept hearing over and over, cuts, and they want a bipartisan solution. Tammy, just putting a button on this whole conversation. You know, we heard Republican Senator Graham saying, hey, don't you want, you know, your home state representatives who go to the same hospitals as you to figure out what you should be doing for your health care? But to the Democrats' point, well, that's great, but there will be cuts to your money as far as, you know, health care is concerned before you can spend it in your state.
Right, so this bill would give states more flexibility, and in a lot of cases, that's a good thing. The governors and the legislators in their state, they know their residents, they know what they need, so that's great. But the trade-off is it comes with less federal support. They're going to eliminate funding for Medicaid expansion. They're going to eliminate the funding for the subsidies and lump it into this block grant. And then again, as we've seen with the other Republican bills, they're going to cap federal support for traditional Medicaid, which covers 70 million people in America. And let me just read you what the governor of Alaska told Senator Murkowski from Alaska yesterday. Sure. This is what she told CNN. It said, I understand that a block grant gives me increased flexibility, but if I don't have the dollars to help implement that flexibility, that doesn't help us much. So again, and that's why he's on the letter that Chuck Schumer referenced. So the Republicans want to give state control. That may be beneficial in a lot of ways, but if there's not enough money, then people are going to get hurt in those states.
Republicans up against the deadline, September 30th for that vote. They need 50 plus 1 being the vice president to break the tie. We'll watch it. Tammy, you'll watch it very closely. We'll talk again. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Let's move on now and let's talk about these major new developments today in the Russia investigation, the CNN exclusive. President Trump's former campaign chief, Paul Manafort, under wiretap surveillance, not once, but twice. And Manafort hearing he might be indicted. That's according to the New York Times. With me now, two former federal prosecutors, CNN legal senior legal analyst.
I would say very senior.
Very super duper senior. Does that work for you? Legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, thank you very much. And Michael Moore, a former U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Georgia. Jeff Toobin, just first to you on, we're having a conversation with Manapuzzo with the New York Times and his reporting, and then Shimon on ours. We're learning how aggressive Mueller is being with this whole thing, then threatening Manafort maybe with an indictment. Maybe that sets the tone for witnesses to not lie. What do you make of how this is all going down so far?
It's a very aggressive investigation. It's an attempt by the Mueller team not to spend 5 years on this, but to try to move aggressively, get guilty pleas if you can, get cooperation, or get indictments, but move this thing along. They obviously think that Paul Manafort is a key figure here. They think they have leverage over him. They have tried every possible way to intimidate him. I mean, in a white-collar investigation, which usually operates by grand jury subpoena and requests for evidence, under penalties, but to search someone's house at 6 in the morning, as they did with Manafort, that's a very aggressive tack. We'll see. Will it pay off with a guilty plea? And let's be fair to Paul Manafort. Let's see whether he did anything wrong. I mean, nothing has been proven or even charged at this point.
That's on the going to his house in the wee hours of the morning, the no-knock warrant. Michael, what about our reporting on the Manafort wiretaps? And just first, just quickly, what would the feds have to show a judge just to get the green light to do a wiretap?
They'd have to give some indication that there was some evidence that a crime was likely being committed. I mean, it's not a simple thing to get a wiretap, and my guess is they've had that for some time, whether that be through financial documents or other people talking, or maybe wires they picked up, or maybe getting picked up on another thing. I agree with Jeff, though. This is aggressive on Bob Mueller's part. My guess is that he's heard the criticism or the concern that the investigation could take a long time, and he's going to stop that. But we're not talking about an ordinary investigation. We're talking about a guy who's been dealing, if the allegations and the belief is right, he's been dealing with Russia or people like that. And so we're not talking about a check forgery ring or anything else. I mean, we're talking about one of the most significant investigations that we've seen in a long time. So I'm not totally surprised by the tactics. I really think it's more of an indication that Bob Mueller means business. He's going to move the case forward. He's sending that as a sign maybe to the public as much as to the potential target, that being Mr. Manafort. He would have had to convince a judge that he needed permission to go in on the no-knock anyway, for fear that Manafort might have destroyed some evidence or done something, either harmed himself, harmed somebody else, destroyed evidence, hit the button on the computer, torn up the hard drive, whatever it was. They must have had some indication that they may have picked up on the wiretap.
So on the wiretap, Jeff Toobin, here's one of the key questions, is in the time, obviously, that he was wiretapped, he was talking to Donald Trump. So we don't know yet. It's not clear whether or not Donald Trump was picked up on the wiretap. If he had, can Bob Mueller use that?
Probably, but it's not certain. I mean, this is where the law gets somewhat complicated. There's a rule called minimization, where if you have a wiretap on person X, you are only allowed to listen to conversations about the subject that is mentioned in the warrant.
Like Ukraine,
like Ukraine or Russia.
Sure.
But if they are talking about other topics, the FBI agents who are monitoring the phone calls are supposed to not listen and not record. That's called minimization. Now, the question would be if the FBI agents were listening and Manafort and Trump, if you speak to Trump, were talking, the question would be, were they discussing something that was within the ambit of the investigation where it would be proper to record it, or were they talking about, unrelated political matters? Do you think Hillary Clinton did well in the debate? Something not germane
What if
to
it was
the investigation?
unrelated to the investigation, but questionable?
My experience is FBI agents tend to err on the side of listen to it and recording it. I mean, because if you minimize and you don't hear it, it's gone forever. A lot of defense lawyers are skeptical about the whole process of minimization. They think it's really bogus. It doesn't really remove any full answer to whether Trump's statements would have been recorded. Probably they would have been recorded, but not definitely.
Okay, Jeff Toobin, thank you. Michael Moore, thank you. Trump's personal attorney's testimony after he releases this copy of his opening statement to the media, but the committee not quite finished with him just yet. We are also following the breaking news out of central Mexico, where there has been a magnitude 7.1. All right, welcome back. You're watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. To this bombshell about one of the central figures in the Russia investigation, CNN has learned President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was actually being wiretapped by federal investigators, not just once, but twice, during a period earlier this year when it was believed he was actually speaking with the president. So let's go right to our correspondent, our crime and justice correspondent, Shimon Prokopez, who is part of our CNN team who broke the story. What do you know?
That's right, Brooke. We're told that there are intercepted communications that raise concerns about whether Manafort was encouraging Russians to help the campaign. Some of our sources told us that intelligence was not conclusive. There's other communications that the FBI has between suspected Russian operatives relaying what they claimed were discussions with Manafort, as well as communications involving Manafort himself. Now, keep in mind, none of this, we're told by our sources, amounted to what people consider a smoking gun in this investigation, Brooke.
All right, Shimon. Thank you. Let me bring in my panel just to discuss all of this and also some of the reporting out of the New York Times about this no-knock warrant for Manafort some summers ago. The New York Times saying prosecutors under special counsel Bob Mueller have flat out told Manafort they do plan to indict him. This happened back in July when investigators searched Manafort's Virginia house, according to the New York Times. So let's talk about all these details with Michael Balboni, former Homeland Security Director for the state of New York, and Charles Clayman, a former federal prosecutor, and Emily Jane Fox of Vanity Fair, who just recently talked to a Trump personal attorney and was supposed to testify behind closed doors. So welcome to all of you. And first, just on Charles, on the Mueller, I guess we could call it doing his job / aggressive tactics / if you're a critic, fishing expedition, how do you see how this is shaping out, and what do you make of how aggressive he is being?
Well, I think it's important for people to know that he's not being aggressive at all. He's using those tactics which prosecutors use in white-collar crimes. They used them years ago in organized crimes, but search warrants, wiretaps, subpoenas, they're in every case. Search warrants and wiretaps, you need a judge's approval. Telling him that he is going to be indicted, that's notifying an individual that he's a target of an investigation. So I think that he's doing, Mr. Mueller, a very good job. I know many of the people that joined him. They're fabulous attorneys, U.S. attorneys' offices from Brooklyn, from Southern District and all over the country. So I think he's doing a very good job. It's a very important case. He doesn't want to make any mistakes. And why wouldn't he use every tool that was appropriately available?
Michael, to you, apparently, according to the sources to CNN, some of the intel from the wiretaps includes communications that spark concerns among investigators that Manafort had encouraged Russians to help in the campaign. How significant is that? Because some of the sources are saying you can't jump to conclusions on that either.
So the whole question in this case has been, what is the information that you can really base conclusions on? And it's all been speculation, and it's he said, she said. If you actually have a wire intercept that puts the definitiveness on the kind of conversation you've had back and forth, that now answers a lot of questions and gives prosecutors the opportunity to sit there and say, yeah, there is a communication, and let's take a look at exactly what that means. And that's where you kind of then you lead the case from.
Yeah.
That is the individual talking specifically about the case that you're really concerned about. But to his point, Mueller is very aggressive. But what people don't really appreciate is there is this whole judicial process behind it. And if you talk to lawyers, they'll sit back and say, this is, not in the no-knock warrants, isn't that used for drug dealers as opposed to white collar? But you recognize that they must have had something, and this is really the theme in this entire case. They're moving as quick as they can and as aggressively as they can. They must have a lot of information that leads them down this path.
What about the wiretap itself? Back to you. The fact that under the two different times, apparently there would have been times where he would have talked to now President Trump. It's not clear if President Trump was picked up on any of the wiretaps or any of the communications. If he had been, would that be within Bob Mueller's purview to use?
Again, a lot of speculation. I believe they probably were FISA warrants
They were.
by the FISA
that.
court. And they're appropriate to use. That's evidence that can be admissible if it's needed, if it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Emily Jane Fox, switching gears off of that, but related in this whole overarching probe, Michael Cohen, Trump personal lawyer, sits down with you at a diner somewhere in the Hamptons, right, to have a chat before he is set to sit with us in an Intel behind closed doors. He puts out part of a statement before he's to go in there, and they say, no, 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 no. We with you.
He nearly teared up when he talked about the fact that he walks past Trump Tower on the way to his new office now and doesn't speak to the president at the advice of counsel again, and doesn't speak to any members of the family who he worked very close with, the Trump organization. And look, I think he is a bit of a showman like his boss, and he's in front of a reporter who's going to be writing all of this, so I think that plays into it. But these are people he worked with every day for a decade, and I think he misses their friendship and was looking forward to today getting this behind him so that he could be in communication with them again.
How long has he known President Trump?
I think
Years
he's
and
worked
years?
there for more than 10 years, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Emily and Charles and Michael, thank you also very much on all of that. I want to get back to our big news, though, on this earthquake. This breaking news, this powerful earthquake, 7.1, rocking Mexico. New video just in. Let's go back to Allison Chinchar. Allison, what are you seeing?
Right, so again, just for a refresher, this was a 7.1 earthquake about 75 miles, give or take, southeast of Mexico City. Here is the dot. This is where the earthquake was located. This, for reference, is Mexico City, okay? The depth of this earthquake was about 51 kilometers deep, give or take about 32 miles. In terms of earthquakes, that is relatively deep, but not deep enough that folks far away wouldn't be able to feel it. Again, here is that point. This is where the epicenter of the quake was located. This is Mexico City, but you can see that yellow color spreading out, indicating that people there still felt it, and not just felt it, but likely encountered at least some damage from the earthquake. The question now is to what extent was that damage and how far out from the center is it going to be, okay? Now, here's the thing. They are going to start to experience some aftershocks in this region. Anything that has been structurally compromised at this point could end up causing more damage as we start to get those aftershocks in, depending on what magnitude those aftershocks are likely to be. Okay, again, here's Mexico City. This is where the epicenter of the earthquake was located. You can see it's down towards the south and east. Closest city likely about Puebla, but you've got some other communities also inside this area that were likely impacted by this particular earthquake. You've got some video there that you can see on the other side of the screen. Again, we've been seeing video and photos come in of damage from some of these places. You know, everything from parts of buildings that have fallen down. You know, obviously you've got some power poles that can come down, things like that. The question is, what is the extent of the severe damage? That's what we need to wait to kind of find out with this particular earthquake, what actually occurred. Again, 7.1 earthquake, about 75 miles to the southeast of Mexico City. As you recall, it'll be 2 weeks this coming Thursday that we just had an 8.1 earthquake in Mexico. So again, the earthquake is on a lot of these people's people's minds. It's still fairly fresh from just having had an earthquake, not in this exact same spot per se, but in Mexico. They just had an 8.1 earthquake that unfortunately had fatalities with it. Again, it will be 2 weeks to the day coming up this Thursday for that particular quake. So again, that's going to be something that we kind of have to keep in mind with this particular earthquake. Brooke?
Allison, just quickly, I'm glad you brought up the 8.1 from 2 weeks ago. Was that in a different part of Mexico?
It was. It was not in this particular location. Again, but it was large enough that the amount of people that felt it was actually pretty widespread. Just like this one, when you start getting to those numbers where they're in the 6s, the 7s, and the 8s, the area that it can spread out is pretty large. So you don't have to be near that epicenter to encounter some damage.
We saw the people in some of those pictures there being treated. So